concept of counterbalancing in work and life. Has work-life balance as a concept had its day? How do we reassess our priorities at different stages of our lives? And what can we do when we feel overwhelmed or tugged in too many directions? Plus, we'll also be looking at some current examples of how employers can best support people's growth and ambitions over their career. My guest is Tom Shaw, Head of Organisation Effectiveness at The Economist. During his career so far, spanning 18 organisations, 7 countries, and 7 sectors, Tom has headed up talent development for Virgin Media, Experian, and Lang O'Rourke, in addition to earlier roles in the public sector. He's also the author of Counterbalance: How to Build Your Career Without Ruining Your Life, a wonderful book that is profound in its exploration and advice on how to live a fulfilling life in both our professional and personal spheres. It's right up there with the best books I've read this year. Tom also practices what he preaches, having undertaken numerous challenges, adventures, and voluntary work, whilst also being the father to 2 young children. Welcome to the business of being brilliant, Tom.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm delighted you can come and chat about counterbalancing that we're going to explore and unpack. And I have to say, as I've just alluded in the intro, you are absolutely the ambassador for counterbalancing. And just for listeners' benefit or anyone watching on YouTube, just to give them a flavour of some of the adventures you've packed into alongside your career. You've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, you've walked the Thames Path Challenge Walk, all 100k, run the Paris Marathon, done the London Triathlon, cycled London to Paris. And the bit that fascinates me the most, you've circumnavigated 95% of the globe overland. I mean, that's just an incredible list. And I'm kind of wondering how you found time to do it all.
Yeah, I mean, I had my 50th birthday last year, and when I was at my party, I gave a speech and I talked about 5 things that I was very proud of, and one of those 5 things was my career and the education that supported me achieving in my career. But then I was also proud of 4 other things, and you mentioned some of them there. So being very, very happily married to Hayley and having 2 delightful, although challenging, children. And also having the opportunity to support lots of different charities, doing lots of these challenging activities. So I really believe in, if you want to get the best out of yourself, you have to have new experiences and push yourself to see how far you can get. And then also, I've spent a lot of time traveling. So I lived in Australia for a year. I lived in Tokyo for 6 or 7 years. I've worked in the US and France and Israel, among other countries. But I've done a lot of traveling overland. So on Greyhound buses and on the Trans-Siberian Railway and on the Indian Pacific Railway in Australia, and as well as trains and buses and automobiles elsewhere. And I've really enjoyed the experience of doing that, because it's very different to air travel.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm a huge fan of train travel, and we try and travel predominantly within Europe by train rather than by plane. I have grown up stepkids in Australia, and one of my big ambitions is to travel on some of the big stretches of railway across Australia. So that's on my bucket list, but not yet ticked off. Great to hear about your 4 or 5 priorities in life. And let's dive into the question about counterbalance, because lots of people at different points in their lives will face lots of competing priorities for their time and their energy, and have things on their bucket list that they want to be doing but aren't managing to get to. Why did you come up with the word counterbalancing, and how is that different or similar to work-life balance for you?
Yeah, so where the journey started for me was probably 21 years ago, when my father sadly passed away. He had leukemia and then pneumonia, and that unfortunately ended his life. And the vicar was sitting, in my mother's living room with myself and my siblings, and she went around the room asking us one single question, saying, "When you think about your father, what was the one thing that comes to mind when you think about him?" And for me, it was an epiphany. It was absolutely about the balance that he created in his life. He was very passionate about his family. He was a great dad, great husband. He was somebody who gave a lot to society. So he volunteered at the church or the Scouts or the school. He was a passionate Leicester Tigers rugby fan. He was very interested in Mount Everest. He was a very popular person who had a wide circle of friends. But he also managed to have a successful career, alongside that. But that was very much at a point of time, in 2003, where you were able to separate your work and your life. So he left for the office. He carpooled to work with two colleagues who lived locally. They left at 7:45 in the morning. He walked back through the door at 5:45 every evening, and you could literally set your clock by it. It was a proper, definitive 9 to 5 job. He worked in procurement for Heinz Food Company. So if my father came back to life now, I genuinely believe that he wouldn't recognize the world that we live in. So the world we live in is far more complex. The reason for that complexity, for me, I think, is twofold. One is exponential technology growth. So obviously, you and I are having a conversation in different parts of the country using technology. So we're able to work more remotely, but we're also able to work on the move. So most of us will have a tablet or mobile telephone, and we can communicate literally 24/7 wherever we are in the universe. So the other thing that's happened, obviously, is that the COVID-19 pandemic came, and I think that there was a generational shift in the way that we go to work just within the space of probably an 18-month period. But I don't necessarily think we've come all the way out of the back of. But I do think that organizations are looking to balance productivity and well-being, and colleagues and employees of organizations are looking to balance those self-same things. So it means that because of that additional complexity and because of the additional flexibility offered in the way that you can go to work, it's not as simple as literally saying your work against your life. It's all of the elements that make up your life. So your career and where you live. So if you wanted to do a house renovation, a house move, your hobbies, how you spend your free time, family, whether you've got children or not, whether you want to set up your own business. And because of the way we do all of those things, they can all overlap each other. So you could literally be within the space of an evening, be doing some work, doing some socializing, doing some house renovation, and they can all be happening concurrently. So for me, it's much more about counterbalancing the different priorities in your life at given moments, rather than just balancing two large objects against each other. And it means that you need to be more proactive about the decisions you make, and you really need to focus on prioritization.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Thank you. And for sharing the story about your dad and the reflections you had about how he lived his life. And I think what you said about, the predictability of his working pattern is something that lots of us are thinking, oh, yeah, that doesn't exist for me. And just as you say, an end to our ability to compartmentalize things and step out of one world and into another. It's so much more fluid and integrated than that, isn't it? So I totally get what you're saying about we have to be more intentional about the different factors that are always at play in our life and our different choices that in any given day we're having to think about in terms of how we're investing our time and our effort and our energy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are a huge number of opportunities that are available to us. Probably more opportunities than there were those 20 years ago. But those additional opportunities are a bit like when you walk into a restaurant and it's got an enormous menu and you can't quite decide, what you'd like to eat because everything looks so great. And it's a bit like that, right?
Yeah, totally. I took my 13-year-old to Chinatown last week with a couple of her friends for half-term fun, and we went into a restaurant. I was faced with the most monumental menu I've ever seen, and I almost had a panic attack and said, "I just need someone to give me a list of 4 things to choose from." And overwhelmed by options can sometimes be a very genuine kind of overwhelm as well.
Mm.
So, thinking over the course of your career and all the life changes that you've experienced and um, commitments that you've put your energy into, what's been the biggest challenge for you, I guess, in managing that counterbalance? Has it come at particular times? Have you noticed anything kind of recurring around when it starts to feel like a bit of a challenge? Because most people will run into this fairly regularly from time to time.
I completely agree. And, one of the points I make in the book, the book's got 14 chapters, and arguably the most important of those chapters is around context. And context will change continually in your life. The only constant in life these days is change. And, I think back to things that have happened in my life, those key transition points. And those are often the times when you do need to recalibrate and refocus and reprioritize. So, for some examples of that, um, I've done a lot of work with people who are relatively young in their career. So maybe they've been an apprentice or a graduate joining an organization. And then a couple of years after that they've done that, they've proven themselves as an individual contributor, but then they need to pivot into being a manager. And for the first time, they're looking to manage other people. And I think that that is one of those critical times in your life where you feel like you're in a spin cycle, and you do need to think really carefully about how much you're doing, how much you're asking other people to do, and what impact that's going to have on all of the other priorities that you've got going on in your life. And I recognize that as being something that a lot of people will go through at a point in time in their career. And I certainly experienced that myself. But then there are also other points. For example, having children. It's probably the one time in my life where your world literally changes. From me sitting on the sofa watching Match of the Day with the Liverpool game coming on first, my wife's water's breaking, and us, we're off to the hospital. And that was almost that pivot point, the inflection point of where your life goes from the old to the new. And I think the biggest context change for me has been when we found out that Noah, our child, our 11-year-old boy, had been diagnosed with autism. It was just prior to his fourth birthday. And everything changed that day, because it meant that our life was going to be very different to that of our peers in our NCT group, or other friends who got children, or people who didn't have children. We were going to be looking after a vulnerable child, probably for the rest of our lives. And if we decided at that point that we were going to continue to live our life in exactly the same way, and weren't prepared to make any compromises or reprioritize, I don't think we'd be having as good a balanced life to the one that we've managed to create for ourselves. And I think it's about decision making. So we made a decision at that point that we had one child there, and we went on to have a second child, Darcy, a little girl who's 9, neurotypical child. And we tend to make decisions as a four. So we tend, rather than thinking, I want to do this, I want to do that, it's more of a kind of council where we agree with each other about what's going to be best. So, for example, it was Darcy's 9th birthday party last Sunday. She was in the climbing venue with her 11 friends for 3 hours. And some of the other parents, whereas I was sitting in the high street in our local town outside in the cold with my son, who refused to eat inside a restaurant and wanted to sit outside. So it's about being prepared to make those compromises, I think. And I think that's the thing that allows you to be successful. I should just make the point, Helen, that I could sit here very easily, 50 years old, and say, I'm the doyen, I know all of the answers, I know exactly what you need to be doing. And life isn't quite as simple as that. There's a definitely you learn a lot through trial and error. And there are 3 or 4 times in my life where I've pushed myself too hard in my career, and it's resulted in physiological health issues that need you to revisit the way that you're living your life, and actually recalibrate and reprioritize. And I don't look back on any of those occasions with any shame. They were all great learning opportunities for me.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Your children sound wonderful. I hope your daughter had a fantastic time in the climbing centre. That brings back memories of me hanging out either on the high street or inside centres as well, like that, soft play centres and things. But yeah, wonderful to hear about them. And you share a lot about, your family and those different pivot points, that some of which you just shared with us just now. And I thought the chapter, I'm just going to wave the book here for anyone that's watching on YouTube. Brilliant, lovely cover. And I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. But the thing about context I thought was super powerful, because our context changes, regularly throughout our life. And as you say, having a fulfilling life, both professionally and personally, is a constant journey of discovery and learning, and like you, I might feel a tad wiser than maybe in my 20s or 30s, but I'm also, as I head into my 50s, and realizing just how much I still have to learn. So I share your ethos that we've not necessarily nailed it all completely. We're still very much work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point on that is that, as we're chasing to catch up, aren't we? The world is evolving so quickly these days. Generative AI, for example, being the latest challenge that is changing the way that we're going to work and the way that we're thinking, and how we get access information. So, however much we learn and become more discerning and more experienced, we've still got the world continues to change, right? So, there's
Yeah.
no such thing as a status quo or a steady state. You've got to continue to revisit decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that spin cycle you talked about, if I think about it at macro level, feels like it just keeps speeding up, just all these global events that, suddenly just change our assumptions and take us into a new direction. So, looking now at your professional life and your professional expertise around helping others to grow their careers and to build their skills and expertise, you've done that in your roles as head of talent development. You've obviously done that as a leader and a manager of others in the organizations you've worked for. And you mentioned briefly, one example of a pivot point for someone when they're getting to the point where they start to take on people management responsibility for others. What are some of the other challenges you hear people say, or the times at which they need a bit more support, perhaps around managing that counterbalance? What are some of the things you've heard people express around that?
Yeah, so I when I was 32, I volunteered for a year for a charity called Chance UK, which gives you the opportunity to mentor a disadvantaged child in London. And over the course of a year, I spent 52 sessions with a child, and also did a supervision session, so 12 supervision sessions, one a month over the course of the journey. I did 3 training sessions, I did an interview, I did a graduation. So it's about 70 sessions over the space of 12 to 15 months. And I remember going along to that initial training session, and they said to us very candidly, the very first thing they said was, if you are thinking of doing this alongside going for a big promotion at work, please don't do it, because you'll be dealing with a child who has been let down many times in the past. They need consistency, they need follow through, they need somebody to deliver on promises. And that's really stuck with me, thick end of 20
Mm.
years now, but I can remember it as if it were yesterday, that message. And I think ever since then, I've always taken that into work. So if I'm working as a talent development professional, or an executive coach, and I'm supporting somebody who's ambitious and wants to get ahead, really thinking about where they want to put their energy at that particular moment in time is the crucial factor. Unfortunately, you do see people who are smart, talented, ambitious, well-meaning, popular, pushing themselves too hard, and some of the legacy of that can be, both mental and physiological challenges that you experience as a result of that, and that takes time to unpick. They're complex, and life is complex,
Mm.
and people have a lot of pressure on them. So it's not, in inverted commas, a quick fix in any way. So, what I'm trying to advocate for in the book is that people are proactive about it. So, when they go into a transition point in their career, going for a promotion, taking on a new role, going into a new sector, moving overseas to work, as I've done myself, really giving yourself the opportunity to prioritize that at that particular moment in time. So you're really hoping that other parts of your life that you're going to counterbalance with are going to be in more steady state. So when I worked for the charity, for example, the job I was doing at that time was in an organization I'd worked in for 2 or 3 years already. I knew the people, I had a network that I could leverage. I didn't have children. I had a partner at the time, but we didn't go on to get married. So my life was easier. I had less pressure on me and less people who were relying on me. But if I were to do that now, I would need to take into consideration, how my context has changed. I'm doing a more senior role. I've got, people who depend on me to provide for them. So I wouldn't have done as good a job of going into that opportunity if I were
Mm.
doing it now. So I'm really pleased that I did it when I did. But it's about
Yeah.
that proactivity of decision making, I think.
Yes. And I guess it's also really important to be communicating kind of the rationale for some of those decisions with the people around you at work and at home, because it might be that, you know, some your context has changed, sometimes not because of your choosing. Say you've got an elderly parent that's whose ill health has suddenly become a really, pressing issue, or or something's changed in your family set up in another way, and you might choose, okay, for the chapter I'm now in, that I have suddenly started to find myself in, I might have to put some things, ambitions, on hold, or I might have to explore a different way of doing what I'm doing today to allow me to devote more energy to this other important priority, um, in the, over the coming months. So I guess, having those conversations with your line manager or a mentor at work, talking to your partner and support network at home is really crucial, right? Because otherwise you're kind of more at risk of battling on alone and feeling like the burden's increasingly overwhelming.
And that's the critical word for me, overwhelm. And I've experienced it myself, where I, worked in an organization where other senior people left, and I was left, holding the metaphorical baby or 18 babies, lots and lots and lots of projects, and
Mm.
people were relying on me to deliver. And at the time, I was less experienced, and I wasn't prepared to share or communicate. I was encouraged to do that, so I took a brave pill, and I went and I had a conversation with a very senior person in the organisation I was working for at that time, and I laid it out there. I said, "This is what I'm faced with. I need some support." And the big thing I took away from that was the reassurance that I got from that individual. She was unbelievably supportive. Said to me, "Go away, have a think about it, come back, and you advocate for what you think we should do. What should we carry on with? What should we park? What should we stop doing? What can we give to somebody else to do?" I made a recommendation. She supported it, literally from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. And there was a really salient lesson that it's much better to be communicating, to the people who can actually help you,
Mm.
both at home but also in the workplace, because you've got a much better chance of being successful. So I agree, it's the prioritization and the communication which is critical.
Yeah. And what I loved about that example you just shared is that the senior colleague could have dived in and said, okay, I'll take over. I'm going to, advise this, or this, or make these decisions. But actually, she didn't. She did gently and supportively put it back on you to help you be intentional and help you come up with, okay, here's a way forward that would work for me and for the business. So that's what I love about the way she responded. She gave you the space, but also the encouragement to make some conscious choices and recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of the Steve Jobs quote, which is, you don't hire smart people and tell them what to do. You hire smart people and ask them to tell you what to do. And I absolutely look for opportunities to work in environments where people are prepared to let you, help to solutioneer or advocate for something. If you're just being told what to do all the time, you're unlikely to be happy, and the organization is unlikely to get the best outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So, turning now to your role at The Economist and all the people in the organization whose careers you're looking to support and grow, Um, can you share one or two things that you're focusing on, or ways in which you are helping people to understand what their career paths might look like and how to fulfill perhaps some of the ambitions, or even to know what ambitions they might be able to fulfill there? How do you go about doing that in the organization?
Yeah, so you'll see it in the book. Obviously, the first chapter of the book, which actually says something really meaningful, is about self-awareness, and I believe that everybody's journey starts with self-awareness. So it's about how can you create environments that allow people to be self-aware. So something I'm very passionate about is transparency in the way that we go to work. So I don't like this idea of you've got a group of executives who are talking about their talent, with in a soundproof room, and then we destroy all the notes afterwards, and we can't possibly talk about any of it. I really want to try and take the essence of what's been discussed that's pertinent for the individual and transfer it back to them and actually talk to them about it in a meaningful way. Not in a way that's going to set an expectation. So if they're seen as a successor for a role in the future, they kind of say, well, that's me then, I'm made and I'm going to get there. It's definitely guaranteed. But explaining, how the organization perceives them and how they can potentially get the best out of themselves. The thing that I'm very passionate about, my purpose, which I also talk about in the book, is maximizing potential. So maximizing my own potential, that of my family, but also that of friends, colleagues, and the organizations that I represent. So everything that I'm focused on is how can you allow people to get to know themselves with a view to them maximizing their potential at some point in the future. And it's not always going to be about a progressive move upwards. It's about thinking about ways that people can get richness and value out of the role they're doing currently, or broadening their role, or taking on a lateral role, which is a different capability or skill set or accountability to what they've been doing, which allows them the opportunity to build more metaphorical muscle, which will allow them to be more successful when they go forward into the future. So the things that we're doing in our new approach to talent at The Economist are much more focused on identification, development, and measurement, which is a traditional way that you would look at talent, but really focusing on an action orientation. In my career, I've experienced organizations where they will put 90% of the effort into the identification, and everybody will feel like they've done a good job because names are in boxes and people feel as though they've been discussed. But it's almost meaningless unless you can actually translate that into activities for people to take advantage of. So all of the structures I've been putting in place and working with senior colleagues at The Economist are about action orientation. What are the specific experiences that people need? What do they need a new role immediately, or can they get some nutrition or nourishment from where they currently are? And then specifically thinking about what development do they need? So executive education or coaching or job shadowing or mentoring opportunity, and then actually measuring the impact that that's going to have over the next 6 to 12 months. That's much more interesting than just measuring where people are on a box or a grid and where they've changed, because it doesn't actually add any intrinsic value to the organization. So I think it's about encouraging self-awareness, encouraging prioritization, and transparency of how the organization and the individual can kind of work together for that individual to grow, and therefore they benefit and the organization benefits.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you to hear how you're going about it, and what you said about previously 90% of the effort going into the identification. That absolutely rings true from my past consulting life, where there's huge amounts of efforts and energy putting into filling in 9-box grids and all that, and kind of slightly more questionable kind of outcomes from that conversation. But I guess you obviously can't support every individual personally in their career and share that organizational feedback with people. So I'm imagining that a big part of this is how you make people aware of the opportunities and career paths and things, so people and that transparency of process, how these conversations happen. But also I guess that you're also supporting managers to have those conversations really well, because
Yeah,
that's who you're relying on really to make this a meaningful experience for each team member.
absolutely. You've nailed it. There's a lot of empirical research that's been published in the last few years that about circa 70% of people's experience in the workplace is based on the quality of their relationship with their boss. And anyone who's worked in a significant number of organizations will have experienced that. And I think I put on the back cover of the book that I've worked for 30 bosses and had different relationships with all of them. But for me, we've really worked hard at trying to define the role of a manager, and we've come up with a 3-point definition. So we've said that it's about driving productivity, developing capability, and protecting well-being. And if you take the second point there about developing capability, for me, there's a lot of research that says that a lot of your development will come from just working on the job. But there are also other ways that you can develop, but you need a talking partner who can help you and a sounding board. And that, for me, is the role of a manager. It shouldn't always be, abdicated and given to a mentor or given to a third party or an external coach. Managers, do need to be brave and be prepared to be open and have open dialogue with people about what it is they're looking to achieve and how they can improve. Because if you leave it up to technology or frameworks or processes, individuals can very easily pick up a piece of paper and tick boxes and say, I've done all of these things, I'm ready for the next role. But that's only part of it. There's also the context of the organization and what opportunities have been created. One of the things I talk about in the book is that I see careers as planned opportunism. So it's up to the organization to create the opportunities, but it's up to the individual to plan for those opportunities when they arise. And for me, the kind of apex that bridges those two things is the role of the people manager. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it. And thank you for sharing how you're going about equipping managers to be really effective in the career conversations and coaching conversations they're having with people. And that is probably bringing us towards the end of our conversation. If people listening want to find out more about the work of The Economist or follow you professionally or get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so lots of ways. So The Economist's got a really good website, or you could become a subscriber to The Economist, which is,
I highly
obviously something
recommend that. It's my
well,
regular
I know
lunchtime
you.
reading.
I know you do, Helen. So that's great. I mean, it is genuinely world class content. So I'm not. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it myself. I'm definitely eating our own cooking from that perspective. But I've got a LinkedIn profile if people wanted to look me up on LinkedIn, and there's a link to the book on there, or you can also find it pretty much anywhere. So Waterstones, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pick a provider of your preference and you'll be able to find the book. I should make the point that all of the proceeds from the book are going to go to the National Autistic Society. So if you pay £15 for a book, £11.50 in effect would go directly to the charity. Yeah, I'd be very grateful if anyone was prepared to support me.
Yeah, do. I strongly recommend listeners to go and get a copy, either for yourself or get ahead of your Christmas shopping if you're listening to this when it goes out in November, and think of someone else that might really enjoy reading it. And whilst you enjoy all the wisdom from it, you can also know that you're supporting a phenomenal cause as well. I was going to mention the fact that the proceeds go to charity. Tom, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and talking about counterbalance, how we can best approach it, sharing some of the wonderful insights and advice from your book, and also sharing how you're helping others at The Economist to counterbalance in their lives too, by paying attention to context, being more intentional, and helping people have really meaningful conversations about how they're doing and what they can aspire for going forwards. Thank you so much for being a brilliant guest.
Thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation.